The phone buzzed against the kitchen table at 11:47 at night, and Daniel Whitfield's calloused hand hesitated before he picked it up. Somehow he knew, before he even read the words, that whatever waited on that screen would change something between him and his son. It always did these days. Ryan didn't call anymore. He texted. Short, clipped little messages, the kind you'd send to an employee you tolerated, not the kind you'd send to the man who raised you, fed you, and worked 18-hour days so you'd never once know what real hunger felt like. Dad, listen, about Saturday, the company gala. Vanessa thinks it's better if you don't come this time. Mr. Hargrove is bringing some really important people, investors, board members, the works. We just need everything to look a certain way. You understand, right? I'll make it up to you, promise. He read it twice. Then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder if he stared hard enough. They didn't. He set the phone down on the same checkered tablecloth Martha had bought at a discount store 31 years ago, back when $1 still meant something, and a promotion meant somebody trusted you enough to hand you their family's whole future. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock above the stove. A clock he had fixed himself, twice, because paying a repairman for something he could do with his own two hands had always felt like throwing money into the wind. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried in a long time, not since Martha passed, not even at the funeral when everyone expected him to. Some men carry grief like a stone lodged behind the ribs, quiet, heavy, permanent. And Daniel was one of those men. He simply sat there at the kitchen table in his old gray t-shirt, a faint oil stain still ghosting the collar from that afternoon's work under somebody's truck. Hands folded together like he was praying, though he wasn't sure anymore what a man like him had left to pray for. He looked at the message one more time. You understand, right? As if understanding were something you could just hand a man like a coat and expect him to wear it without a single word of protest. He typed back 4 words. Of course, son. Whatever's best. Then he turned the phone face down on the table, the way you'd cover something you didn't want to look at anymore, and he sat there in the dark long after the porch light outside had drawn its last moth of the night. 34 years, Daniel had worked with those same hands. Not in an office with his name on a glass door, not behind a desk where a secretary brought him coffee, but underneath cars, inside engines, elbow deep in grease that never fully washed out from under his fingernails, no matter how hard Martha used to scrub at them with a kitchen brush on Sunday nights before church. He owned a small garage on the edge of town, Whitfield Auto and Repair, a squat brick building with a hand-painted sign that had faded from red to a dusty pink over the decades. It wasn't much. It had never needed to be much. It paid for Ryan's school shoes, Ryan's baseball glove, Ryan's college textbooks, and later, quietly, without either of them ever discussing it out loud, it had paid for a good chunk of Ryan's wedding to Vanessa, the daughter of a real estate developer who owned half the good lots on the north side of the city. What Ryan didn't know, what almost nobody in this town knew, was that before the garage, before Martha, before any of it, Daniel Whitfield had spent 11 years in the United States Army, the last 6 of them as a command sergeant major, the kind of rank that men didn't earn by keeping their heads down. He had led young soldiers through places whose names never made the evening news, had carried more than one of them out on his own back when the transport trucks couldn't reach in time, had buried friends in far-off soil and written letters home that he still, to this day, couldn't read without his jaw tightening. When he came home for good, he folded that uniform, folded that whole chapter of himself, and put it away in a cedar box at the top of the closet, because the war was over, and a young family needed a father who came to dinner every night, not a soldier who still flinched at car backfires. He never once told Ryan about the medals in that box. Not out of shame, but because Daniel had never believed a man's worth should be measured by what he kept in a drawer. He believed it should be measured by whether he showed up, whether he kept his word, whether he worked honestly even when nobody was watching. And for years, that had been enough. Ryan had grown up proud of his father, would tell his friends that his dad could fix anything with an engine in it, would sit on the workbench swinging his little legs while Daniel taught him how to properly torque a bolt, how to listen to an engine the way some men listen to music. Somewhere between college and the wedding, something in Ryan had begun to shift. Slowly, the way a floorboard doesn't creak until years of quiet pressure finally wear the wood thin. It started small. Ryan stopped inviting his father to lunches with Vanessa's family. Then he stopped mentioning the garage when people asked what his father did, saying instead that his dad was in the automotive industry. a phrase that sounded polished enough to survive a dinner party but distant enough to keep Daniel's grease-stained hands out of the conversation entirely. Vanessa's parents, Richard and Colleen Ashford, were the kind of people who measured a man's value by the label on his watch and the zip code on his mailbox. And from the very first Thanksgiving, Daniel had felt their eyes slide past him in the doorway, the way you'd look past a delivery man standing on the porch. He remembered the first time Colleen Ashford had called him a burden, though she hadn't used that word directly. Not that day. It was subtler than that. At Ryan and Vanessa's engagement dinner, at a restaurant with white tablecloths and a wine list thicker than the Bible, Colleen had leaned toward her husband and murmured, just loud enough for Daniel to hear over the clink of silverware, that it was sweet, really. That Ryan had come so far despite where he started. As if the garage, as if Daniel's whole life's work had been an obstacle Ryan needed to overcome, rather than the very ground he'd been raised to stand on. Daniel had said nothing that night. He had simply smiled, thanked the waiter for refilling his water, and driven home alone in his old pickup truck, while his son stayed behind in a rented tuxedo, laughing at jokes Daniel wasn't part of. It kept happening in small, cruel increments, the way water erodes stone. At the wedding, Daniel wasn't seated at the family table, but 2 tables back, near the kitchen doors beside distant cousins of the Ashfords he had never met. At Ryan's promotion dinner the following spring, Vanessa suggested gently that maybe Daniel could wear something a little more, her words, appropriate, since there would be photographers. At the housewarming party for their new home, a home Daniel privately knew had been paid for in no small part by a loan he had quietly co-signed without ever mentioning it to a soul, Ryan had introduced him to a group of colleagues simply as, "This is Dan," and left it at that. No father. No son. Just Dan. A name that could have belonged to anyone. A name stripped clean of everything it actually meant. Each time, Daniel absorbed it the way he absorbed everything. Silently, without complaint, telling himself that Ryan was young, that Ryan was trying to build something, that maybe, in time, his son would remember where he came from. He never once said a cruel word back. He never once reminded Ryan of the cedar box in the closet, of the years he'd spent overseas, of the sacrifices that had bought Ryan the soft, comfortable childhood that made it so easy for him now to be ashamed of the man who built it. Daniel simply kept showing up, kept fixing cars, kept sending a little money every month, even after Ryan insisted he didn't need it anymore. Because that is what fathers do. Whether or not anyone notices, whether or not anyone says, "Thank you." The Saturday of the gala arrived gray and overcast, the kind of sky that seemed to be holding its breath. Daniel spent the morning in the garage anyway because idle hands on a heavy day were dangerous company, and there was a transmission on lift 2 that needed attention regardless of what his heart was doing. He worked in silence, the radio turned low, replaying Ryan's text message in his mind more times than he cared to admit. You understand, right? He understood plenty. He understood that his son had married into a world where he no longer fit the frame, and rather than widen the frame, Ryan had chosen to simply crop his father out of the picture. Around 6 that evening, his phone rang. An actual call this time, not a text. And for one foolish half-second, Daniel let himself hope it was Ryan, calling to say he'd changed his mind. It wasn't. It was an unfamiliar number with a city area code he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but some old instinct sharpened by years of never ignoring an unexpected call, made him answer. The voice on the other end was crisp, formal, unmistakably military in its cadence even after all these years. "Command Sergeant Major Whitfield," the voice said. "Is this really you?" Daniel's chest tightened. Nobody had called him that in over 2 decades. "This is Marcus Hargrove, sir." "Second platoon, back in '94. "You probably don't remember me. I was just a private back then, green as they come. You pulled me out of a burning transport when I was too scared to move my own legs. You carried me 200 yards on a blown ankle, sir, and I never got the chance to properly thank you because you were reassigned before I even woke up in the hospital tent." For a long moment, Daniel couldn't speak. The garage around him seemed to fall away entirely, replaced by dust and heat and the deafening thunder of a memory he had folded up just as carefully as that old uniform. He remembered a private with wide, terrified eyes, remembered the weight of a young man's body across his shoulders, remembered praying, actually praying, for the first time in years, that they'd both make it to the medics in time. "I remember," Daniel said quietly. "I remember you, son." Marcus Hargrove's voice cracked slightly before he composed himself. "Sir, I run a company now. Corporate real estate investment. Nothing glamorous, but I do all right. I recently hired a young man named Ryan Whitfield onto my executive team, and I'll admit, sir, it never once crossed my mind that Whitfield could be your boy. Not until I saw his father's name listed as an emergency contact on his employee file 2 days ago. Daniel Whitfield. I nearly fell out of my chair. Daniel sat down slowly on an overturned bucket beside the lift, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. I'm hosting a gala tonight, sir, Marcus continued. Ryan told me his father wouldn't be attending. Some scheduling conflict, he said. I have to be honest with you, Sergeant Major. That answer didn't sit right with me, not for 1 second. A man like you does not miss an event where his son is being honored, unless something else is going on. So I'm calling to ask you directly, sir, and I hope you'll forgive the presumption. Would you do me the honor of coming tonight as my personal guest? Daniel looked down at his hands, the same hands that had carried a frightened young soldier through smoke and fire, the same hands that had spent 34 years quietly, invisibly, holding a family together, while that family slowly forgot what those hands had built. I wouldn't want to embarrass anyone, Daniel said finally, his voice steady but low. Sir, Marcus said, and there was something firm in his tone now. Something that reminded Daniel of the young soldier who had once looked up at him with absolute trust in the middle of chaos. With respect, sir, the only people who ought to feel embarrassed tonight are the ones who thought hiding you was a good idea. The gala hall glittered that evening with the particular kind of polish that money buys and character rarely earns. Chandeliers throwing soft gold light over round tables draped in ivory linen, a string quartet tuning quietly in the corner, waiters gliding between guests with trays of champagne balanced like they'd trained for it their whole lives. Ryan stood near the center of the room in a tailored charcoal suit. Vanessa on his arm in a shimmering emerald dress, both of them wearing the easy, practiced smiles of people who believed, tonight of all nights, that they had finally arrived exactly where they belonged. Ryan had told himself all week that keeping his father away was simply practical, a small, harmless omission in service of a bigger picture, the picture of a polished young executive with a polished young family and no rough edges left showing. He hadn't let himself think too hard about what it meant that the rough edge in question was the man who had given him everything he now stood there enjoying. At exactly 8 o'clock, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened and Marcus Hargrove walked in. Tall, silver-haired, moving with the unmistakable bearing of a man who had once given and taken orders that mattered more than any boardroom decision ever could. The room's chatter dipped instinctively, the way a room does when it senses importance before it can name it. Marcus scanned the crowd once, found Ryan near the center table, and began walking directly toward him and just behind him, a step back, in a simple dark blazer that had clearly been pressed with care but was decades removed from anything tailored, walked Daniel Whitfield. Ryan's smile froze on his face like a photograph left too long in the sun. Vanessa's grip tightened on his arm. Across the room, Colleen Ashford's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. Ryan, Marcus said warmly, loud enough to carry, "You didn't tell me your father was such a legend." Ryan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Vanessa's eyes darted between her husband and the older man standing quietly beside their host, trying and failing to reconcile the grease-stained hands she'd spent years politely avoiding at family dinners with whatever authority now seemed to hover around him like static in the air. Marcus turned fully toward Daniel then, and something in his posture changed entirely, straightened, sharpened, and the entire ballroom, without quite understanding why, fell utterly silent. Marcus Hargrove, CEO of a company worth more money than most of the guests in that room would see in 3 lifetimes, snapped to attention, heels together, chin lifted, and rendered a slow, formal, unmistakable military salute. "Command Sergeant Major Daniel Whitfield," Marcus said, his voice ringing clear across the marble floor. "Sir?" "Yes, sir." Nobody moved. Somewhere near the bar, a waiter froze mid-pour. Colleen Ashford's champagne glass finally made it to the table, set down with a small, nervous clink. Richard Ashford straightened his tie, as if the gesture alone might restore some order to a moment that had clearly slipped entirely outside his understanding. Marcus held the salute for 3 full seconds, then lowered his hand and extended it instead, grasping Daniel's in both of his own weathered hands. "This man," Marcus said, turning to address the stunned room, "saved my life on a night I don't talk about very often. Carried me on a blown ankle when I couldn't stand, when men twice his rank were looking for cover instead of soldiers. I owe him every single year I've had since, including every dollar in this room tonight. And when I found out, quite by accident, that his own son had asked him not to come this evening, I have to tell you all. I very nearly canceled the whole event out of principle. Brian's face had drained to a color somewhere between white and ash. Vanessa's hand slipped slowly from his arm, as though putting even a small amount of distance between herself and whatever humiliation was unfolding might somehow protect her from it. Sir, Brian finally managed, his voice small in a way it hadn't been in years. I didn't know. He never told us any of this. Marcus turned to him, not unkindly, but with the plain, unhurried honesty of a man who had long ago stopped softening truths for comfort. That's exactly the point, son, he said. He never told you because he never needed you to know in order to be proud of you. Men like your father don't announce what they've given. They just keep giving, quietly for as long as you let them. The question tonight isn't why he never told you who he was. The question is why you decided all on your own that he wasn't worth having in the room. Daniel stood through all of it in silence. The same silence he had carried through 34 years of Greece and long nights and unspoken sacrifice, though something in his chest had loosened just slightly, the way a held breath finally lets go. He didn't gloat. He didn't look at Ryan with triumph, didn't scan the room for the satisfaction of watching Colleen Ashford's composure crumple at the edges. He simply reached out and gently returned Marcus's handshake with both of his own weathered hands, the same hands that had once carried a terrified young private through fire. You did fine that night, son, Daniel said quietly, only for Marcus to hear, though the whole room seemed to lean in regardless. You didn't need saving as much as you think. You just needed somebody to walk beside you until you remembered you could walk on your own. Later that evening, after the toast had been given and the room had slowly exhaled back into its normal rhythm of clinking glasses and polite conversation, Ryan found his father standing alone near the tall windows at the edge of the ballroom, looking out at the dark parking lot beyond the glass, at his own old pickup truck parked modestly among a row of gleaming imports. "Dad," Ryan said, his voice thick, "why didn't you ever tell me? Any of it?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching the reflection of the chandeliers ripple faintly across the window glass. "Because I didn't raise you to respect me for medals in a box, son," he said finally. "I raised you to respect me for showing up, and somewhere along the way, showing up stopped being enough for you. That's not something a uniform can fix. That's something only you can." Brian's eyes filled, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, he reached out and pulled his father into a real embrace. Not the stiff, dutiful hug reserved for photographs, but the kind a boy gives the man who taught him how to walk when he was small and unsteady on his feet. "I'm sorry," Ryan whispered. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I let this whole world make me forget who actually built me." Daniel patted his son's back once, twice, the same steady rhythm he used to use when Ryan was small and couldn't sleep. "It's all right, son," he murmured. "Just remember it now. That's all's father ever really asks." Across the room, Vanessa stood beside her mother, both of them watching the quiet reunion with faces that had gone carefully, deliberately blank, aware that whatever social ground they'd thought they were standing on had just shifted permanently beneath their expensive shoes. Word travels fast in rooms like that one, and by the time the last guests had collected their coats, the story of the humble mechanic who turned out to be a decorated command sergeant major, the man his own family had tried to hide away, had already made its way around every table in the building. Whispered behind champagne flutes, remembered far longer than any promotion or wedding photograph ever would be. Daniel drove home that night the same way he always did. Alone, windows cracked slightly to let in the cool evening air. Radio turned low to an old country station he'd listened to for 20 years. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated exactly. He felt more than anything, quietly at peace. The way a man feels when a truth he carried alone for a long time is finally, gently, allowed to breathe. He parked in his usual spot beside the garage, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the dark looking up at the same stars he'd looked at 100 times before, over deserts and battlefields and quiet driveways alike. Somewhere in that house behind him sat a cedar box he hadn't opened in years, holding medals nobody in his family had ever seen, holding a version of himself he'd folded away, not out of shame, but out of love, so that a little boy could grow up believing his father was simply wonderfully ordinary. Tonight, that boy had finally understood there was nothing ordinary about a man who gives everything and asks for nothing in return. Not applause, not gratitude, not even acknowledgement. Only the quiet, steady chance to keep showing up. And in the end, that is the truest kind of strength there is. The kind that never needs a uniform, a title, or a salute to prove itself real. Though, every so often, when the world least expects it, it gets one anyway.